possible. First, the Veterans Museum for allowing me to do a Coffee and Conversations. I think these are really great, and they really help a lot of people understand some of the historical events that might not be touched on, or they sometimes actually have people who know a great amount of that stuff, and I think it's great that we have that within a community. Some other people I'd like to thank is the Front Range Community College, not only because they have helped me develop this paper to links that I could never imagine, but they allowed me to actually have it published with the school as well. So now the paper will be inside databases across the country very soon. So I'm very excited for that, and I think it's a great accomplishment. Some people I'd like to name out that specifically helped with this would be Cecilia Wygrant, who's the History Department's director for making it possible. Michael Hughes, who's actually one of the key editors in helping me develop the final product, and it was one of my mentors as well. Julia Maypole, who was one of my history professors and who had a great understanding of Russian history to help me dial in where I wanted to study the most. Michael Zakonas, who was actually helping me with the draft of the first of this paper, and then Richard Ortner, who's actually with us today, who helped me with public speaking and helping me being able to come up here and actually do this. So I'd like to thank them very much for everything that they've done for me. So beginning with what we're talking about today, I'm not just going to be talking about specifically the fall of the Soviet Union and the reasons for it falling. I'm also going to answer the question of what could be kind of seen as alternative history, but the question of if Gorbachev had more time, could he have saved the Soviet Union? And to really answer that question, the examination that I began doing was in 1960, where most of the problems occurred, and then I would study further up until about 1985, where everything began to collapse. So when we're beginning this, let me go into this real quick. I'd like to also bring this to our attention, which is why do we study history? Why do we study anything, really? And it's mainly because we want to understand the importance of what is fake and what is real, so what's misinformation and what is fact. Another reason that we would study history like this is it's the key to our future. As we've seen in the recent years, these problems have come back to bite us in the butt, and now we are now seeing things like the war in Ukraine, we're seeing wars in other countries, and some economic decline that have been leading up for the past 40 years. So it's really good to understand how this is the key to our future. And then most importantly, it's good for yourself. Not only is it good for your understanding of every decision, every problem that you occur, but it helps your life drastically. I mean, by understanding this stuff, I've been able to understand most of the 20th century and its issues. So let's get to the main beef of everything. So what is the big question? Well, if Gorbachev had more time, could he have reconstructed or helped the Soviet Union? So to answer this question, what I did was I started in 1960, like I said previously. The Cold War rivalry between the US and the USSR was at its top, at its beginning. It was just starting, but it was getting very impressive. Impressive, yes. As Zubock said, who is a historian over at the University of, I think it's Harvard, a struggle between the two superpowers of control for the global future on both the imaginative and geopolitical level is the way to describe the Cold War. In pursuit of global dominance, the Soviets would begin to invest not only in its economy, but two other areas, its ideology and its military. As we'll see later on, it will also implement policies that have never been seen within the Soviet Union. Specifically, we would be looking at glasnost and perestroika, two different policies that we'll later on touch. But this is just a little preview of it. So, when we're looking at the Cold War and the pursuit for domination over the globe, we can see that there are proxy wars throughout the Cold War that have been showing up. Things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, which can be seen as a way to dominate with military superweapons. Afghanistan, which is a proxy war fought by the United States, by the Afghan people, and by the Soviet Union. Vietnam, which can be seen as a proxy war. Korea, and many others that are not listed up here, especially with Germany being split in half. When this happens, the USSR will develop weapons such as ICBMs and place them across the globe. Beginning in 1969, however, the Soviet economy is struggling. Since it was putting so many weapons, specifically 50% of its GDP towards weapons and food, clothing, and other weapons in order to cover the globe, it created a problem for the Soviets. The economy was crumbling, and the people were beginning to lose hope in their country. Abram Bergeson, who is an economist back in 1950, actually looked at these studies, and he said, for the principal reason of such underperformance, according to the voluminous Western research, one need not look further than the Soviet system of central planning for these daunting tasks and superior agencies, and how deeply flawed everything is. So when looking at these issues of underperformance, I specifically tried to look at the factories of the Soviet Union and to find out why there was such underperformance. When I did that, I could find that there was no social welfare for the country because so much money was spent towards the government, the military. There was no resource directory because most of the resources, including food and basic needs for people, were being forced into military and not any of the civilian needs. And then most importantly, it was used abroad. So if they were to put such as soldiers onto other fronts, or they were funding other people like the North Vietnamese in Vietnam, they would put most of that food and clothing and weapons over there. Abram Bergeson also suggested that with this research, that while the Soviet trade services obliviously leave much to be desired, doubtful impression to create the observers is due to no small degree than reoccurring shortages. So, when we think of the shortages, we think of the food, we think of clothing, we think of these other goods. The reason that there were so many shortages wasn't just because of military, however. It was also because of agriculture. With the agricultural revolution of the Soviet Union failing, where they were trying to build so many farms and trying to make as much grain and other products as possible, it failed, mostly due to weather, but also misuse of farms as well. Another problem was that the people were struggling to industrialize. Much of what the Soviets were doing at the time was trying to farm and not as much put their materials towards industry. They felt that industry was very limited and very, I would put it, unuseful, I guess, misused in other ways. And to put it bluntly, they were wrong. Industry was revolutionizing beyond the Soviets' understanding, and with limited technology, they were unable to continue with agriculture, and they should have switched to industry, but they will never do so. Another problem with their economy and why there was such a shortage was actually a NATO embargo. There was nothing ever said to the Soviet Union about it, but there was a secret deal with Jimmy Carter and for a short time Ronald Reagan, where limited trade will be implemented to the Soviet Union, where NATO will just completely and purposefully tell the Soviet Union, we're not going to be trading with you, we're not going to give you goods. And it was mostly...
Excuse me, scoot yourself a little closer to the center.
How's that one?
Yeah, just keep going. There.
Right there? Okay.
I'll see an image of that.
Sorry about that. But there was a NATO embargo that magnified the effects. The embargo implemented by Jimmy Carter and for a short time Ronald Reagan, which eventually would actually be Gorbachev's friend, was limited trade from 1960 to 1980. There were no Navy ships used for this embargo. There was no sort of military embargo whatsoever. Instead, it was just there to choke the economy. So with NATO not trading with the Soviet Union, what happened next was that there was nothing happening for them in the fact of goods coming in and services being used. But the last thing that actually occurred to the situation at hand before Gorbachev came into power would be the Kremlin and the political issues that it faced. Not only did it have about 40 to 50 years worth of power vacuums between several different leaders, but research has now shown that there's also a cultural problem within the Soviet Union where ideas of socialism and Marxism and the differences between them and how they should work through these multiple different leaders actually changed and altered culture and politics forever. And what essentially happened was that the people of the Soviet Union did not understand the difference between socialism and Marxism, and they began to merge from people such as Stalin or later on Khrushchev, who also altered it drastically. So when that occurs over several 40, 50 years, what then happens is the Kremlin finds themselves in a scramble to fix the Soviet Union. Visions of the Soviet Union began to crumble. People began to be confused and misunderstood the political agenda that the Kremlin was trying to build for so many years. Disagreements in policy, destruction of cultural identities such as statues and government buildings will occur for several 40, 50 years. And eventually what will happen is opinions will shift drastically. I thought I heard somebody said they had a question. Okay. So with these key issues on the table, and here's actually a graph of the per capita that they had compared to Germany, the United States, and France. This is how much they were producing overall with each good and how much those goods would cost. And this was data from the CIA back in 1991 after the Soviet Union collapsed. So what happens next is we get Gorbachev to come into power. Previously, he would actually be the agricultural department. He would be the head of it for the Soviet Union. And his idea was to actually produce mass amounts of grain and to produce as much agriculture as he could possible, in which it failed, as we saw previously. So when Nikolai Gorbachev actually becomes the premier of the Soviet Union, people are very disgruntled inside the government about it. They've seen his ideals, they've seen what he's written about, and they really don't take a liking to him very much. But they're willing to give it a chance because they have nothing else left to try. So with Gorbachev coming into power, what happens next is we start going into something that historians like to call new thinking. And Gorbachev has even agreed with this idea as well, where Gorbachev's plan is to reform the Soviet Union into new thinking, because the Soviets have been in old thinking for so long, which was to keep everything solidified, keep everything quiet, and we're going to try to do this on our own sort of a policy. With Gorbachev, however, he wants to try to reform the Soviet Union into what could be only described as a democracy of some sort, a mix of Marxism and democracy, a socialist democracy even. And this quote up here is a great way, and this is by Carrel, who's also a historian, over at, I think it's Harvard, that describes it very well, where it's the first intended to release the potential of the Soviet people and improve them, but soon it became a communist survival strategy instead. I think it's a great way to describe what Gorbachev ended up having instead of a thriving society. So we start going into the reformation of the Soviet Union. Reformation can be described into a 4-year plan, which we know how 4-year plans go with the Soviet Union. It first starts with perestroika, which can be seen as reconstruction in Russian. And he was going to reconstruct the economy. He was going to reconstruct everybody into a global economy. He was going to bring the Soviet Union into a new industrialized standards instead of agricultural standards, and much more that he would do later on, but would never be able to do. Another thing he also did is glasnost, which is openness. And this idea was that people would be able to talk to the government and the government would respond back. As previously seen, when accidents happen or when people have issues inside the Russian government, instead of talking about it openly like we do here, or with people having an opinion, it would instead lead to you being, I guess, put away is the way to put it. People weren't able to openly talk about their religion. They weren't openly able to talk about their politics and all these other issues. With openness, when you talk to the government, they'll talk back. They'll tell you the situation at hand. They will give you that information. They will open information to you, such as the internet or books. And this would be a drastic difference, as we'll see later. But when looking at these ideas of new thinking, let's go to perestroika first. Perestroika, when we're looking at the industrial standards of reconstruction, was an idea of where taking an isolated economy and making it a global economy. Now, that's a very big step to take from the Soviet Union standards, especially with how big the Soviet Union is at this time. So, instead of opening the whole Russian economy into this vast open economy, they instead decided let's go ahead and let's open up the Eastern Bloc to this instead. So Gorbachev's plan for this was to first implement places like Lithuania, Lithuania, Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, and these other smaller Eastern Bloc countries into this open economy. And the reason for this is because if their economy fails, it's not our economy, so it'll be fine. And it's much smaller, so we can recover quicker. When this happens, it is described as a spillover, an overwhelming amount of information, an overwhelming amount of goods and services happening. And the Soviets could not keep up with what was happening. When they first opened this up, they had the person at the helm of the economy building doing all the work for them. They essentially said, you have all this, you're going to go ahead and you're going to do all the books for us, tell us how much is coming in, how much we're putting out. And it was too much to handle. So when this happens, they are then allowed to give it to the countries instead. So places like Latvia and Estonia were able to get their own person in charge of their books. And they were told, here you go ahead and tell us what's going on, and you report back to us. When this happens, the people with Glasnost have open understanding of what's happening and realize how much they're missing out on the open world. They realize that they aren't getting access to all the information on the internet. They're realizing that they're not getting all the goods that they could be getting from all this, from the open world. And what eventually happens is it starts a revolt. Places like Estonia, Ukraine, and specifically Latvia will be an open revolt by 1991 when all this is over. And they will decide to break off from the Soviet Union, and it was primarily because they had the goods to do it. They had the services to do it. They had their own economy, and they realized they didn't need the Soviet Union anymore to do so. So they would break off. And it's described mostly as an economic improvement that can no longer be sustained by the Soviet Union. From there, though, as seen actually on this one, you can see all the years that they're going to break off, and who else would break off from places like Yugoslavia. After that, though, the government begins to panic, and they realize they didn't have a leash on who was coming in and who was going out. And little did they know that places like Norway and the United States, and specifically Western Germany, were actually feeding them information that led them to also revolt. They led them to this break off of the Soviet Union, and it was essentially a kick in the knee for the Soviet Union. They lost a lot of their economy. Ukraine is one of the biggest grain producers for the Soviet Union, and they lost that, and they lost a lot of money from that. Places like Poland would produce a lot of ores, a lot of iron, and a lot of other materials with factories, and they would lose that because of this break-off. And so the government begins to panic about these problems. And when they start breaking into independence, whether it was violence or whether it was a peaceful break-off with elections, they could no longer get a hold of them. So from then on, we go to Glasnost, which can be seen as the second part of the 4-year plan that is a problem. Glasnost is social, religious, and political openness. And this is the main piece of the cake right here, I would say, is the main reason for the Soviet Union for falling. When this happens, when things like, how would I put it? Like places like Chernobyl were to happen, and where they're able to tell their people what happened and they become very upset by it, it would be one of the main reasons that people start questioning their government. Where things like open revolts in the Eastern Bloc start happening and people are realizing it, that starts making people question things. And with openness happening, it provides a big hole in their reconstruction plan. So, from there, we then go into the aftermath of that. When glasnost and openness of the public happen, people no longer want to be a part of the Soviet Union. They believe that it's failed, and they believe that the government is no longer being able to financially help them and financially keep them afloat. So, when that campaign fails, Gorbachev continues to do a couple things here and there. One of them is opening polls, opening to open elections mostly, which will lead to new leaders to approach the podium. And with political changes happening so quickly, with trying to do it so quickly, it would cause just disarray completely into other political issues. Which brings us into the Dark Age, which is after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, where even though there is a government standing and there is somebody at the helm, the country is not listening, for one. But it's also that the country isn't being listened to. So when I interviewed some people from Ukraine, they were explaining it as a dark age, specifically because there was no food, there was no government taking the helm of what was happening, there was no police force, there was also no lights whatsoever. It was dark at night, people were getting robbed out of nowhere for no reason, and people were desperate. Eventually what happens is the mafia will try to take control of Russia in this power vacuum that can be seen. And things like the Berlin Wall will fall, and even that political cartoon is really good. And people would begin to lose hope. What happens afterwards is pretty substantial. We know that Putin will later take control, but first we have Yeltsin in the helm. Yeltsin can only be described as a couple things: an alcoholic, unpredictable, and irrational in his decisions. There are several instances, even here in Denver, where he was found drunk in the street when he was here for political deals with the United States, and specifically one at the Brown Palace where he was here, which is down in Denver, where he was here for I think it was a meeting for global standards, and he was found drunk in the street. So you can go actually see that if you want. They actually have a little thing about Yeltsin over at the Brown Palace. But from then on, Yeltsin would try to reconstruct it back to what the Soviet Union was, which was a centralized government. But instead what happens is he did something else. He did something called a CIS, which is a central state of independent states, where somebody is controlling these independent states, but everybody else is controlling the decisions in their states. And when something has to happen politically overall with a group of people, they'll come together and they'll talk about it. But in later 1999, after several incidents about Yeltsin being drunk or making decisions that the Kremlin didn't want, it would lead us into the Russian Republic that we see today, the Russian Federation, if you would, that we see today, which is at the helm of Vladimir Putin. But to answer the question that we're all thinking about is, could Gorbachev have changed anything with all these issues? Could Gorbachev have changed the opposition that he was against? And to put it bluntly, it's no. With all these issues that he had, with the economy failing, that he took a part of, that was just too difficult to change, with the policies that were being implemented that people found just taboo and not very Marxist and just outlandish, and he didn't have that political support. He didn't have the people's head, the people at the helm. It didn't work, and it wouldn't have worked. What would have eventually have happened is that Yeltsin would have taken control and changed the exact same thing, and it wouldn't have done anything for us. So that leads us into what's happening today. With Ukraine breaking off in 1991 and all that grain being lost, what happens now is over 20 to 40 years of different political spectrums, especially with Ukraine. Russia just cannot hold itself together still. It's still in disarray. It's still having problems keeping itself together. It is still having problems with its policies and with its economy, and it's causing a problem for them. So their only option is to go to war, to try to bring back their economy, to bring back their Eastern Bloc, and to try to bring everybody back into that helm. So those 20 to 40 years have eventually come back to bite them in the butt in trying to bring them to where they are today. That's all I got for you guys. I know it was kind of rough. I'm sorry if I rambled. But does anybody have any questions? Yes?
What role do you think Chernobyl had in this whole thing?
I asked somebody from Ukraine about Chernobyl and how it had an effect. And from her personal problem, or for her personal opinion. She said that it was not even a domino effect. She said it didn't have any reason to cause what we had in Russia and how it fell. Instead, she believes it as just an incident that happened. And even though there's incidents where people get really mad about it, and there are people who rebel against it to this day, they don't feel they think it's separate issues entirely. But I wondered that same thing too.
There are those who say that it brought down the Soviet Union.
Yeah, even Gorbachev blames it on Chernobyl, funny enough. If you read his book, he'll actually reference it once or twice, and there's a quote by him where he says that Chernobyl was the reason that the Soviet Union fell. And like I said, Glasnost, with it being open discussion about everything, that's where that really started too, is because then the Soviet Union, even though they tried to cover it up, they were forced to tell about it, because then the United States found out about it, other people found out about it through detections of radiation in Norway and Sweden, and they were forced to tell about it, and when they realized that they were lying about it, people were questioning it a lot. Is there any other questions? Yes?
On October 31st, 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, wasn't that not a much more significant contributory factor?
I mean, it was a big factor, yes. The reason for it would be because of that breakoff too. When the Soviet Union fell, Gorbachev was told to take down the wall. And the main reason for that was because not only could they not keep people out, but when revolt did begin happening in East Germany, because they realized the Soviet Union was falling apart, they would have incidents where people were just jumping over, and soldiers weren't told to shoot on sight anymore. They had no commands. So it becomes really a turning point, if you would. I would say that's the description of it, is a turning point. Yes?
I think you articulated that Gorbachev was kind of a last resort
Mhm.
option. And you said because I think basically articulated because they had tried everything else. I was just wondering what else they had tried prior to Gorbachev.
So they tried leaders like Khrushchev, and then they would later try Yeltsin, who I guess you could describe that as your last resort.
True.
But he was your last reliable source, because
He was a failed minister.
Yep.
of agriculture.
yeah, so he was the agricultural man. So he knew all about the farming. He understood it. He went to school for it too, actually, and that's what he majored in. The problem was, when it all came down to it, there was nobody else more qualified than him. And then when Yeltsin took control, he was qualified, but with his yeah.
On the ladder
Yep, and the reason why he actually got taken out of office was he was forcefully taken out in 1991, when they were having elections. They realized that Yeltsin wouldn't win, and what they did was they had all the Eastern Bloc and these other states sign a contract that essentially said, we're breaking apart the Soviet Union, you can have your own independence. And when he signed it, because there was no Soviet Union left, he was out. And then Yeltsin would be put in for that Central Independent States, that CIS that took control. Yeah.
First, amazing presentation. Thank you very much. I have a question.
Yeah.
Based on something you said during the presentation.
A little louder.
I'm sorry. I have a question, but amazing presentation. I have a question. Based on your presentation, you said that countries like Latvia, Lithuania, some of the Baltic countries
Yes.
had the economic wherewithal to break away from the Soviet Union.
Yep.
And you look to an extent, Eastern Europe, or Eastern Germany has been a success story. Do you think, if you were to look at the other side, when those countries started to break away from the Soviet Union, do you think Europe was going, yay, or do you think Europe was going, oh no?
When the Eastern Bloc was breaking apart?
Yes.
So you were wondering if the Europeans...
How do you think Europe was perceiving that world they were about to inherit?
Well, I knew the United States was going, yeah, that's great, good for you, primarily because they knew that they won the Cold War. But for Europe, it was a great success for them because, like I said earlier, places like Norway, United States, Britain, and even Western Germany were actually funding those smaller states when they opened up to a global economy, primarily to do that exact thing. That was their whole plan, was to let those states become independent in order to cripple the Soviet Union, but also to help them out because they realized how bad it was. When that Eastern Bloc came down and people were actually going back in to see what happened, they didn't realize how bad it was with technology being so limited, with people starving in the streets like they have for the past 70 years since Stalin's rule in Russia and all these other problems. And they wanted to make sure that they were economically stable, which is how Ukraine is able to fight its war today. It's slowly declining into economic disarray and they're having issues. But with the United States trying to keep them afloat, it just may work.
Could you go back to the slide which showed all of Eastern Europe
Yeah.
and stuff? Because much of our discussion and the issues currently faced with is, it seems to me, is associated with the Russian view that this whole area, which is their access, you know, if World War II showed them if they didn't control kind of this border area, it opened up the whole Russian plain
Yep.
for a massive attack from the west, and they still worry about that for some
Yep.
reason or another.
Well, and if you remember too, all this area right here, Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and all these other places actually had better industry than even the Soviets. They've been behind for so long.
And I think the other issue, which seems to be their concern, particularly that they could see here, is all those little countries on the edge of the Soviet Union now had full access to see the rest of the world and what in heaven name is going on and how well the rest of the world is doing. And that is the major threat, you know, to the Soviet Union, well, Russia now. And, you know, that's partly also what we're seeing, I think, in Ukraine.
Yep.
You know, Ukraine, if they survive this, and we hope they will, you know, will be offered to join NATO and obviously then the EU. And to have that on the border of a very large, successful, prosperous, you know, country, it seems to me would be the major threat for the, you know, Communist Party.
It would. Yeah, especially if Germany fell with it, having the wall, that's one of their main sources of defense.
Now, you didn't mention anything about the rise of the oligarchs, which we heard
Yeah.
all the time now. How did that fit in, and when did that occur, and do they still exist?
Which part of it? Which?
Well, the oligarchs, I mean, the Russians that were connected to the government and stuff were then able to become fabulously wealthy.
Oh, yep.
In the period of
I mean,
Glasnost or whatever.
primarily what they were doing was they were trying to influence Gorbachev to do this because they were so wealthy. They realized after so long that, you know, open democracy would be good.
But
I mean,
how
open
did they
trade.
accumulate the wealth?
Well, primarily it was for goods. So if they had businesses that they would fund towards the government, so because they were having troubles with money, they would give money to the government in order to try to get some money back, kind of like what we do here. But it just wasn't able to do it. They were so far behind technology-wise, it was just unable to do so. So when they realized that was happening, they're doing the same thing they're doing now, which is escape from the country for a little bit and come back later and see what happens, and then fund whoever's winning. I mean, that's kind of how it always goes, right? One thing I forgot to mention, though, was that the other reason that this was failing, particularly, especially with the economy, was that if you remember how communism works, it's a centralized system where when you're working in a coal mine, when you're working in a lumber yard, everything that you're producing is for the good of everybody else. Like, everybody gets a piece of the pie. The problem is, when they tried to go to open economy, especially with these Eastern Bloc states who've been influenced by this for so long, a lot of people actually didn't like the idea. And they found it taboo because they were like, well, what have you been telling us for the past 60, 70 years? What happened to, we're going to do this all on our own, we don't need anybody else, we'll be the dominant superpower of the world. So a lot of people just found it taboo and outlandish sometimes. There were some that were on board with it, but not enough until later on. Yes?
On your map, between Lithuania and Poland, the little slice there is called Russia. How does that work when it's separated from the rest of Russia?
Where is it?
Yeah,
Okay,
it's-
go to
Oh, this
Lithuania,
right there.
Right there.
I forget what we call
I think
that.
that's a typo.
No, that's an actual.
Kaliningrad?
Yeah,
No.
it's that
I
little
think I heard the name.
tiny slice of
Yeah.
Russia.
No, it's
Guess-
a little slice, it belongs to Russia.
Okay.
It does not have a direct
Kaliningrad or
contact.
something.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Kaliningrad, yeah.
And it's the only, and what makes them really hot to trot about that,
Boats.
it's the only access of a Russian port to the Baltic Sea.
Okay.
And so all the time, they're trying to figure out and how to expand that connection there. And that's why, again, there's so much effort to try and undermine, these other small little independent states there.
especially that one.
Also has significant naval assets.
Well, that's their only place they can do it.
Even though you
And now
know
that
your Navy isn't
Finland's
great.
part of NATO, that even cuts things off even more for them further north. So, it's, what do you if you could predict what Putin and the Russians are gonna do over the next 3 years, what do you expect?
I mean, the only predictions I've heard is like they're trying to reform the Soviet Union, and the other one I've heard is they're actually trying to reform the Russian Tsar, which that had way more claims than actually the communists had. I'm not entirely sure where they might go next. If I were to just give a random guess, I would say Estonia and Latvia for how small they are and with how limited their defense force is. But with them in NATO, it makes it practically impossible. So if anything, this might be another World War I where it's just a stalemate until somebody gives up or until somebody economically collapses, which might be what the Russians are doing because they're seeing that the United States is kind of in its own little issues down here somewhere, that it's not looking at Ukraine right now.
Well, I think one of the things I think we've seen a lot in the news lately is there's going to be a focus on them to get as much of the Ukraine as they can, settle that. But I think our CIA and all the other intelligence groups and even in Europe are highlighting a very concerted and massive effort to try and denigrate and kind of weaken the liberal governments throughout Asia, throughout Europe. And, this kind of rise of oligarch, what do we call the term? God, boy, you can see as you get older, short-term memory really goes. But there's a tremendous effort. I mean, if we thought there was Russian interference trying to influence our elections in 2016 and 2020, already we're seeing that being done, not only here, but in all throughout the countries in the EU, trying to denigrate and drag down the existing democracies there. And that doesn't
Yep.
require a lot of effort, on their part. They can pretend there's hands off. But you do see the rise very much of autocracy in terms of right-wing efforts throughout Europe. And certainly that whole focus here.
Yep. And a lot of elections here were actually rigged pretty heavily
Yeah.
to where they were trying to keep their Soviet, I guess you can call them premiers if you want, but their Soviet leaders in control.
Yeah.
And when those open elections happened, that all fell to pieces very quickly.
So that kind of highlights the importance of NATO, at least from my perspective.
It does.
This whole thing.
It definitely does because it keeps the whole world together, and with NATO becoming what could be seen as a policing force and a force trying to keep peace in all of the world, it's definitely something that needs to be continued for a very long time.
What do you see, our focus always seems to be on the western part of the Soviet Union, but they have all these vast regions on the eastern side, from Siberia on
Mhm.
down, and how do they control those areas?
Typically, it's kind of the same way they did it with these, where they would have different, I think I have a slide here, this right here, where it's the different sections of who controls what and who makes the decisions. It's primarily what they try to do is they try to keep those sections put by somebody in charge, and then they report back what's happening, and then the president does what they need to do, kind of like what we do in the United States. But as for invasion-wise,
Oh, no, that's not an issue, really.
yeah, never going to happen.
But whether or not they control the resources and stuff
Yep.
out there, and I think what you do see is kind of some breakaway areas.
Yep, and that was the difficult part with the country being so big. That was the main problem of why they couldn't open up to the economy. There was so much that they couldn't do it, so they made them a testing ground. They made the Eastern Bloc a testing ground. And that's also why the Soviets fell, like I said, I think it was the beginning where it was mismanagement of resources. When they were actually writing down their resources, the Western, what was it? They had graphs. I looked at graphs and I looked at a lot of statistics, and they weren't actually on point at all. And we don't have the exact numbers to this day from what the Soviets were previously telling us. And the CIA even did their numbers, and a company called IMEMO, which is an international economy market for the globe, who does their statistics to make sure that you're telling us the truth and you're not holding anything. They did their numbers and they combined them. And that's what that graph was that I showed, is those combined numbers that the CIA put together. But we don't actually know the exact numbers of what they were producing. All I know for certain is that we outdid them in nuclear missiles, we outdid them in wood production, metal production, and I think the only thing we didn't outdo them in is oil, and particularly because of the Caucasus and how much oil they produce. Who?
It's not exactly a positive. I think the next decade is going to be, well, probably next 5 years are going to be quite interesting.
Yeah.
Well, not only there, but I think in our own country.
Well, and I'd like to do my next paper kind of on Khrushchev and kind of figure out where that stemmed from. And the leader before Khrushchev, I can't remember his name particularly right now, and figure out kind of how those problems definitely began and what decisions kind of altered that. Because Gorbachev just handed this a situation, and they're like, have fun.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think one of the interesting things is who's going to replace Putin eventually? Who's the next in line?
That's a good question. I mean, they just found that guy off the streets. You've seen the pictures.
Oh, yeah.
He was just some KGB officer, and they're like, "Hey, I mean, you got a lot of experience." So and then he went for an election, and he won.
Yeah, well, we've seen that happen too.
Yeah.
So
I think you had a question.
Yeah.
Your studies have been pretty much all political, right?
For the most part, yeah. True.
How much study and analytical work have you done on the social aspects of all of the studies, including this entire huge country?
So like are you asking about like the people, like the general people in society?
Yeah, well, for instance, I understand that Russia is, both war and peace, is going to be presented as an opera
Mm-hmm.
in Moscow. In fact, it started about 2 or 3 months ago, and that opera is supposed to run for 2 years, and it analyzes the social aspect. And how much investigations that you have done have covered that kind of area?
I mean, to my knowledge at least, I can't give you an exact of how much, but the stuff that I've looked at particularly for the past 2 papers would be the policies, which was one.
So have you read the book War and Peace?
I've not read the book War and Peace yet.
That's a really long book.
It is a long book. I've seen it.
It covers
We've
all
seen the
of
movie.
We've seen the movie.
Something that I would really recommend that you investigate.
I'll definitely take a look at it.
Yeah, Chuck.
Looking back on it, it's hard to keep the timeline straight.
Definitely
But
is.
what I remember at the beginning of the whole process of the dissolution was Poland with Lech Walesa, who really started getting democracy into Poland
Mhm.
before anybody else.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know when the Berlin Wall came down, but I was in there somewhere. But I do know that Russians were allowed to go to the satellite countries in
Yep.
the East. And that's, in my thought, was where they learned about Western values and going back home to Russia and spreading the word.
Yep.
That had a lot to do with a lot that followed. So I think Lech Walesa was the first president, I don't know what he was, of Free Poland, basically, but he was the guy, as I remember, who really led the charge
Yep.
to the whole process.
He kept the boat afloat, that's right. Definitely that.
And once that occurred and appeared to be successful, it obviously ignites the same thought of
Right,
thoughts
right.
in other adjacent, countries who are under the Soviet control. And I think that's still their biggest threat. And if anything, I think Putin very much worries about Ukraine joining the EU and NATO and being right on their doorstep. And essentially, if you look at Poland's part of NATO, Belarus is not, but what they're kind of seeing is almost now a circle all the way around, to the Crimea, of quote, threats. But I think less of a military threat, they look at it, is the cultural, experience and the success of the European, model versus the Russian one.
Yeah. It is another issue.
So, I mean, it's quite something.
Oh,
We
yeah.
live in interesting times, let's say, at least no world
Chinese
war,
curse.
lots of, squabbles everywhere. And hopefully the Ukraine issue can be settled, which gives them a sense of independence.
Yeah, definitely does.
So, but I think we're gonna have to support them along with the, European
We're
allies
talking-
for a good while.
We're talking about a huge population
Oh, yeah.
aspect of the entire world. And you go to that, I was telling you about that War and Peace as being presented as an opera.
Yeah.
Well, now, 2 months later, after they started that, and really drawing a lot of attention, some social aspect of Russian people has invaded that opera and tried to destroy the building it was in. And so there's so much different political things that are really bordering on social things.
Yeah.
We got a huge opportunity to work with that. I signed the wall when it was put up a week after it was opened up to anybody who wanted to sign it. And I was there and looked at it, and we spent a whole month there. So that's why I'm presenting.
Yeah. Sounds like a great opportunity to start taking a look at that.
Gotta be a little careful, but anyway. Josh, thank you so much. We
Of
want to
course.
give you one of our challenge cards.
Nice. Thank you.
And as Josh pointed out, he's a volunteer with us here, particularly in our archival area. It's been just a great help to us. So we're always looking for other volunteers who can help us in one manner or another. So, thank you very much. Please come up and visit some more. There's a lot we can talk about. Here, in fact, well, I should just highlight, Lisa won't want me to, but Lisa Hale is right in the back there. Lisa's family were from Finland, and during 1930s, we had the Winter War and then the Continuation War, which was the prelude to World War II up in Finland. And her parents and father, ultimately escaped from there, came to the U.S. Her father actually was hired by the Army to help train the 10th Mountain Division troops on winter fighting. Eventually served in Korea and retired, I think, as a lieutenant colonel. But we're going to have Lisa back here in August to tell that fascinating story. So keep watching your calendar. Well, watch for new
Mark the date.
marketing stuff from us on that.
Would you have him stand up or introduce himself?
Oh, well, Lisa, okay. Could you stand up so Larry can see you? Yes, but anyway. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Of course, thank
Come
you.
up and talk some more. Talk about all sorts of Eastern Europe.